18,000 feet above New Guinea, a P-47 Thunderbolt trails a thin stream of hydraulic fluid from its left wing root. The pilot's flight suit is soaked through with blood below the shoulder. 3 Japanese fighters are closing from 7 o'clock, gaining at nearly 50 miles per hour. The fuel gauge shows 47 minutes to Wewak. The clock on the instrument panel reads 11:42. Standard doctrine requires immediate disengagement, a dive to the deck, a run for home. Instead, the throttle goes forward. The nose drops toward the enemy formation below. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was not designed for what this pilot was asking. 18 cylinders arranged in twin radial rows, each one hammering through combustion cycles at nearly 2,700 revolutions per minute, pushing the airframe through air that grew thinner with every 100 feet of altitude. The manifold pressure gauge held steady near 42 inches. The oil temperature crept toward the upper edge of acceptable. The aircraft was functioning, but only just within the margins that Republic aviation engineers had deemed survivable. At this altitude, the P-47D weighed approximately 14,000 pounds with remaining fuel and ammunition. That mass meant inertia, a stubborn resistance to rapid course changes. A roll rate of roughly 60 degrees per second was possible in clean configuration, but the damage to the left wing had introduced asymmetry. The control stick required constant pressure to maintain level flight. Every correction cost energy. Every energy loss translated to lost options. Below and behind, the 3 pursuing aircraft maintained a shallow climb. Their closure rate indicated lighter airframes, higher power-to-weight ratios at this altitude. The performance curves were not in the American fighter's favor for sustained maneuvering combat above 15,000 feet. The P-47 was optimized for diving attacks, for converting altitude into speed, for slashing passes that exploited its robust construction and heavy armament. It was not optimized for turning fights against nimble interceptors. The pilot understood this mathematically, instinctively, without needing to consult any manual. He had logged hundreds of hours in this exact airframe, had learned its rhythms, its complaints, its narrow corridors of excellence. He knew that the aircraft shuddered at 320 miles per hour, indicated when banking hard to the left. He knew that the engine ran rough if throttle adjustments came too quickly after extended high-boost operation. He knew that the .850 caliber machine guns in the wings carried enough ammunition for approximately 20 seconds of continuous fire, but that continuous fire was wasteful, imprecise, the mark of a novice. None of this knowledge suggested re-engagement. The wound in his shoulder was not immediately life-threatening, but it was degrading his performance with each passing minute. Blood loss caused tunnel vision, slowed reaction times, compressed the cognitive horizon until only immediate tasks remained accessible. A pilot in this condition could maintain straight and level flight. A pilot in this condition could probably execute a standard approach and landing if he reached friendly airspace. A pilot in this condition had no business initiating combat maneuvers against multiple adversaries. The hydraulic fluid leak meant uncertain landing gear deployment. The system might function. It might not. There would be no way to know until the moment of truth over a friendly runway when the gear handle moved and either the wheels dropped into position or they didn't. A belly landing in a P-47 was survivable if executed properly on a prepared surface. It was considerably less survivable in the jungle terrain between here and the nearest American airfield. These were the calculations that doctrine demanded. Assess damage, assess threats, assess probability of survival. When the numbers aligned against continued engagement, the proper response was disengagement. Pilots were expensive to train, difficult to replace, essential to the ongoing air campaign across the Southwest Pacific. Aircraft could be rebuilt, Factories in Indiana and New York were producing P-47s at rates that seemed almost industrial in their relentless efficiency. But the men who flew them required years of instruction, months of operational seasoning, countless hours of accumulated judgment that no production line could replicate. Colonel Neel Kearby understood all of this. He had helped write some of the tactical guidance that governed fighter operations in this theater. He had briefed younger pilots on the mathematics of aerial survival, had emphasized the importance of discipline over impulse, of calculated aggression over reckless bravery. He had built his reputation on precisely the kind of restraint that his current situation demanded. Yet the throttle remained forward. Behind him, the three fighters continued their climb. Below him, a formation of American bombers pressed toward their target, crews trusting that the fighter escort would keep the skies clear. The escort was fragmenting. Two P-47s from his flight had already turned for home with mechanical difficulties. Another had lost visual contact in the scattered cloud layer that stretched across the approaches to Wewak. The coordination that made fighter sweeps effective was dissolving into isolated engagements, scattered aircraft, broken communications. If the pursuing fighters completed their climb, they would have altitude advantage over the bombers. If they had altitude advantage, they could execute diving attacks that the heavy aircraft could not evade. If those attacks succeeded, American air crews would die over the jungle, their bodies and machines scattered across terrain that might never yield their remains. The geometry was simple. The math was brutal. The decision was already made. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Neel Ernest Kearby arrived at aerial combat through a pathway that suggested patience rather than flash. Born in Wichita Falls, Texas, in 1911, he carried the measured temperament of the American Southwest into an occupation that often rewarded impulsiveness. While many of his contemporaries in the pursuit aviation community cultivated reputations for daring, Kearby cultivated something less dramatic, but ultimately more valuable. He cultivated precision. His entry into the Army Air Corps came in 1937, relatively late for a man who would eventually command fighter operations across an entire theater. By the time Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor, Kearby had accumulated nearly 5 years of military flying experience without ever firing his guns in anger. He had spent those years instructing, evaluating, learning the institutional rhythms of an Air Force that was rapidly transforming from a small professional cadre into the largest military aviation organization in human history. The instructional years shaped his approach to combat in ways that would become apparent only later. Teaching inexperienced pilots how to survive required breaking complex maneuvers into component parts, analyzing each element for points of failure, identifying the margins between success and disaster. A good instructor learned to see flying not as a continuous fluid experience, but as a series of discrete decisions, each one carrying consequences that cascaded forward into subsequent choices. Kearby absorbed this analytical framework so thoroughly that it became invisible, integrated into his reflexes, his perception, his basic understanding of three-dimensional space. Where other pilots felt their way through combat, relying on instinct and reaction, Kearby calculated. He processed variables, assigned probabilities, identified optimal solutions. The process happened quickly enough to seem intuitive, but it was rooted in systematic thinking rather than raw talent. This methodology made him an unusual figure among the fighter pilots of the 5th Air Force. The community that gathered in New Guinea during 1943 included men of extraordinary natural ability, pilots who seemed to understand aerial combat at some primal level that defied instruction. Richard Bong, who would eventually become America's highest-scoring ace, flew with an almost supernatural sense of positioning that allowed him to appear at unexpected angles, to find firing solutions that other pilots couldn't perceive until they were already obsolete. Kearby was different. He flew by calculation rather than intuition. His engagements followed patterns that could be diagrammed, explained, replicated. He approached enemy formations with the methodical precision of a chess player, positioning his aircraft for maximum advantage before committing to the attack, maintaining escape routes until the moment of decision, preserving options that more aggressive pilots sacrificed in their eagerness to close. This approach produced results that were undeniable if unspectacular. By October 1943, Kearby had accumulated a respectable number of aerial victories, each one achieved through patient maneuvering rather than dramatic confrontation. He had proven that systematic aggression could be as effective as improvisational brilliance, that discipline and calculation offered pathways to success that complemented rather than contradicted natural talent. The men who flew under his command in the 348th Fighter Group learned to trust his judgment even when his orders seemed counterintuitive. He would decline engagements that appeared favorable, citing factors that junior pilots couldn't perceive. He would extend missions beyond comfortable fuel margins when the tactical situation warranted, demonstrating confidence in his calculations that bordered on mathematical certainty. He would accept criticism from superiors who questioned his conservatism, secure in his understanding that sustainable success required different methods than spectacular individual achievement. His physical presence reinforced the impression of controlled competence. 32 years old in October 1943, Kearby carried himself with the settled confidence of a man who had found his profession and mastered its fundamentals. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with features that suggested German ancestry and eyes that missed very little. Subordinates noticed that he rarely raised his voice, rarely displayed frustration, rarely deviated from the calm deliberation that characterized his approach to every challenge. The reputation he carried into combat over New Guinea was therefore precisely calibrated to the methods that had created it. Neel Kearby was known as a pilot who would find the right angle, wait for the right moment, execute with the right technique. He was not known as a pilot who would press attacks against unfavorable odds. He was not known as a pilot who would sacrifice tactical advantage for emotional satisfaction. He was not known as a pilot who would choose continuation when doctrine demanded withdrawal. All of which made his decision on the morning of October 11, 1943, completely inexplicable by every standard he had spent years establishing. The missions that preceded October 11th established patterns that made the day's events all the more striking in retrospect. Kearby had flown repeatedly over the complex terrain of New Guinea, had learned the weather patterns that governed visibility, the thermal currents that affected aircraft performance, the geography that created corridors of approach and avenues of escape. His typical engagement profile reflected his analytical nature. He would lead his flight to altitude before entering contested airspace, establishing vertical advantage that could be converted to speed or positioning as the tactical situation developed. He would cruise at engine settings that balanced fuel efficiency against the need for rapid response, maintaining sufficient power reserves to accelerate or climb if threats materialized. He would space his wingmen at intervals that allowed mutual support without compromising individual maneuverability, creating a flexible formation that could adapt to changing circumstances. When enemy aircraft appeared, Kearby's response followed consistent patterns. He would assess the situation before committing, counting aircraft, estimating altitudes, identifying aircraft types, evaluating relative positions. Only after this assessment would he initiate engagement, and only if the analysis suggested favorable odds. His attacks came from above whenever possible, using the P-47's weight and diving acceleration to create closure rates that enemy pilots struggled to counter. The technique worked. His victory count reflected not superior flying ability, but superior decision-making, the accumulated advantage of dozens of small choices that placed him in favorable positions while his opponents struggled to respond. He rarely found himself in desperate situations because he rarely allowed desperate situations to develop. His missions ended with predictable regularity: aircraft returning to base with fuel remaining, ammunition partially expended, pilots debriefed and rested before the next day's operations. This consistency made him valuable beyond his individual contribution to the air war. The Army Air Forces in the Pacific needed pilots who could fly mission after mission without accumulating damage, without requiring rescue, without consuming the limited resources that kept the air campaign operational. Kearby's methods produced exactly this kind of sustainable output. His aircraft came back. His wingmen came back. His intelligence about enemy dispositions and behaviors proved reliable. The fuel management that characterized his approach became almost legendary among ground crews. Kearby's P-47 typically returned with fuel reserves that other pilots considered excessive, margins that he justified as insurance against the unexpected. The argument was sound. New Guinea's weather could change rapidly, turning clear routes into instrument conditions that demanded extended flight time. Enemy activity could force diversions, adding miles to planned routes. Mechanical difficulties could reduce efficiency, consuming fuel at rates that exceeded normal calculations. By maintaining reserves, Kearby ensured that these contingencies remained manageable rather than catastrophic. His pilots learned to plan the same way, to build margins into their fuel calculations, to resist the temptation to extend engagements beyond prudent limits. The discipline this required conflicted with the aggressive instincts that had drawn many of them to fighter aviation, but the results justified the constraint. The 348th Fighter Group developed a reputation for completing missions, for returning aircraft and crews, for reliable contribution to the theater's air superiority campaign, all of which makes what happened over Wewak on October 11th particularly difficult to reconcile with everything Kearby had demonstrated about himself over the preceding months. The mission began conventionally enough. A fighter sweep intended to clear the airspace ahead of bomber formations targeting Japanese installations near Wewak. 4 P-47s, Kearby leading, with 3 pilots from his group flying wingman positions. The flight launched from their base at Moresby, climbed to altitude over the Owen Stanley Range, proceeded northwest toward the target area. Weather conditions were mixed. Cloud layers at various altitudes created zones of limited visibility, patches of clear air alternating with regions where horizon references disappeared into white opacity. Navigation required attention, cross-referencing landmarks against plotted positions, maintaining awareness of heading and elapsed time when visual confirmation became impossible. The enemy formation appeared without warning, emerging from a cloud layer below and to the north. Multiple aircraft, the count initially uncertain, climbing toward the American flight's altitude. The geometry favored the Americans, who held altitude advantage and could choose their moment of engagement. Standard doctrine suggested a diving attack, a single pass at high speed, then a climb back to altitude and reassessment. Kearby led the attack exactly as doctrine prescribed. The 4 P-47s rolled and dove, building speed, converging on the enemy formation from above. The compressed timeline of the attack allowed only seconds for firing, each pilot selecting targets, aligning sights, pressing triggers for brief controlled bursts. The engagement scattered the enemy formation, aircraft breaking in multiple directions, the coordinated threat dissolving into individual responses. What happened next departed from every pattern Kearby had established over months of methodical combat flying. The standard procedure after an initial diving pass was clear, codified, drilled into every fighter pilot who transitioned through combat training. Complete the pass, maintain speed, extend beyond the enemy formation's effective response envelope, then climb back to altitude using the energy accumulated during the dive. Assess results. Count remaining threats. Evaluate fuel state and ammunition. Decide whether to re-engage or withdraw based on the updated tactical picture. Kearby did not follow this procedure. The diving attack had achieved its primary objective. The enemy formation had broken apart, aircraft scattering in multiple directions, the coordinated threat to the approaching bombers temporarily neutralized. The initial firing pass had almost certainly damaged at least one enemy aircraft, though confirmation in the chaos of high-speed maneuvering was impossible. The P-47s were now below and ahead of where the enemy formation had been, with altitude to regain, fuel consumed, ammunition partially depleted. The situation called for disciplined withdrawal to altitude, the restoration of the tactical advantage that had enabled the successful initial attack. Instead, Kearby pulled the nose of his aircraft up into a climbing turn, bleeding speed rapidly, trading the kinetic energy of the dive for altitude gained in a steep ascending spiral. This maneuver carried significant risks. The P-47 was heavy, and climbing flight at high angles of attack consumed energy at rates that left little margin for error. The engine, already working at high power settings during the dive, was now being asked to sustain maximum output through an extended climb. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. The aircraft's speed decreased, moving it closer to the performance envelope where its advantages over lighter enemy fighters diminished. The reason for this unexpected maneuver became apparent seconds later. Below and to the left, additional enemy aircraft were emerging from the same cloud layer that had concealed the first formation. The initial contact had been only part of a larger defensive response. More fighters were climbing toward the airspace where American bombers would soon appear. From his current position, Kearby could see what his wingmen could not. The geometry of the developing engagement, the threat vectors, the timing that would determine whether the bombers arrived in cleared airspace or flew into a contested combat zone. The climbing fighters had not yet reached altitude to threaten the heavy aircraft, but their trajectory and rate of climb suggested they would achieve that altitude within minutes. The disciplined response would have been to radio warning to the bomber formation, to vector the remaining P-47s toward the new threat, to coordinate a conventional interception. There was time for this. The threat was developing but not yet immediate. Standard procedures existed precisely for this type of evolving tactical situation. But standard procedures assumed communication systems that were functioning, formations that were intact, wingmen who were in position to respond. The reality over Wewak on October 11th was considerably messier. Radio communication had become intermittent, possibly due to atmospheric conditions, possibly due to equipment malfunction. One P-47 from the flight had already turned back with mechanical difficulties. Visual contact with the remaining wingmen was uncertain in the patchy cloud conditions. Kearby was effectively operating alone against a developing threat that exceeded what any individual pilot should reasonably engage. And then the rounds struck his aircraft. The hit came from below and behind, from an enemy fighter that had climbed faster than expected, that had found an angle through the turning engagement, that had closed to effective firing range while Kearby's attention focused on the larger tactical picture. The impacts were concentrated on the left wing and forward fuselage, A burst of perhaps 2 seconds that walked across the aircraft's structure before the enemy pilot lost his tracking solution. The P-47 absorbed the damage with the structural resilience that Republic Aviation had engineered into every airframe. No critical flight surfaces separated, no control cables severed. The engine continued running, its 18 cylinders maintaining their synchronized combustion despite the airframe shuddering around them. But the damage was real and immediate. Hydraulic fluid began streaming from the left wing root, where lines feeding the landing gear actuator had been punctured. The pressure gauge in the cockpit began dropping, confirming what the visible leak already suggested. One or more rounds had penetrated the cockpit area, fragments striking Kearby's left shoulder, tearing flight suit fabric and the skin beneath. The wound was not disabling, but it was bleeding steadily, and the pain was demanding attention that the tactical situation could not spare. The rational response to this damage was immediate disengagement. A wounded pilot in a damaged aircraft had no business continuing combat operations. The fuel state, while adequate, did not provide comfortable margins for extended maneuvering. The hydraulic system failure meant uncertain landing gear deployment, a problem that required planning and preparation rather than improvisation under fire. Every variable in the survival equation had shifted against continuation. Kearby leveled his wings, assessed his instruments, checked his remaining ammunition, and turned back into the fight. The physics of what followed demanded precise execution of techniques that no training manual had anticipated for these circumstances. The P-47's performance characteristics created options, but only for a pilot who understood exactly how to exploit them within the constraints that damage and injury had imposed. The aircraft's strongest attribute was diving acceleration. The heavy airframe, combined with the powerful engine, created velocity that lighter enemy fighters struggled to match in pure vertical performance. Kearby understood this advantage instinctively, had built his entire approach to aerial combat around the conversion of altitude into speed, the use of energy management to dictate engagement terms. His current altitude, roughly 16,000 feet after the initial engagement, provided exactly the resource he needed. Below him, the climbing enemy fighters had not yet reached their optimal combat altitude. They were still working against gravity, their engines straining, to pull them upward through air that grew thinner with every foot gained. Their attention was focused on the bombers that had not yet arrived, on the threat that doctrine told them to prioritize. Kearby pushed the nose over and dove. The maneuver was violent by design. The P-47 accelerated past 300 miles per hour, then 350, then 400, indicated as the altimeter unwound in a blur of descending numbers. The control forces increased with speed, requiring more pressure to achieve the same deflection, demanding physical effort that the wounded shoulder protested with sharp, insistent pain. At 420 miles per hour, the aircraft began to buffet slightly, approaching the compression effects that marked the edge of controllable flight at these speeds. Kearby held the dive for another 2,000 feet, building velocity that the enemy aircraft above could not match without initiating their own dives, abandoning their climb toward the bomber altitude. Then the pullout began. 4.5 G-forces compressed his body into the seat, drove the blood from his head toward his feet, narrowed his vision to a tunnel that centered on the instrument panel directly ahead. The wounded shoulder shrieked with the increased pressure, torn tissue compressing under forces that no human anatomy was designed to withstand repeatedly. The aircraft groaned, rivets and skin panels flexing under loads that tested their structural limits. The dive became a climbing turn, speed trading for altitude, the energy of the descent converting to vertical positioning that placed Kearby above and behind the enemy formation he had just passed through. The maneuver had consumed perhaps 20 seconds, had covered nearly 2 vertical miles of altitude change, had repositioned the engagement from one of defensive necessity to one of offensive opportunity. The enemy pilots responding to this unexpected reversal faced a tactical problem that their training had not prepared them to solve. The conventional response to a diving attack was to scatter, to deny the attacker concentrated targets, to wait for the dive to end, and then pursue from altitude advantage. But Kearby had not extended away after his dive. He had converted immediately back to altitude, had appeared behind them where no pursuing aircraft should have been able to reach, had transformed a defensive situation into an offensive one through sheer mechanical audacity. His approach to the reformed engagement was calculated despite the chaos. The 850 caliber machine guns in his wings required convergence, the precise alignment of multiple trajectories at a specific distance ahead of the aircraft. Firing outside this convergence envelope dispersed the rounds, reduced hit probability, wasted ammunition that could not be replaced until the aircraft returned to base. The optimal firing range was approximately 250 yards, close enough for accurate tracking, far enough to allow correction if the initial burst missed. Kearby closed to 300 yards before firing. The burst was controlled, perhaps 3 seconds, the aircraft shuddering as the guns expelled their projectiles toward the target ahead. Tracer rounds marked the trajectory, bright lines against the sky that showed where the other rounds were traveling. The enemy aircraft ahead absorbed impacts across its fuselage and engine cowling, smoke beginning to trail immediately as internal damage spread. The wounded pilot should not have been able to execute this sequence. The blood loss was affecting his coordination, slowing his reactions, degrading the fine motor control that aerial gunnery demanded. The damaged aircraft was pulling to the left, requiring constant compensation that divided his attention between flying and fighting. The fuel gauge had dropped noticeably during the high-power maneuvers, consuming margins that he had calculated so carefully before the mission began. Yet the engagement continued. A second firing pass, another enemy aircraft damaged, a third approach, ammunition running lower, the guns cycling through rounds at rates that made mental calculation of remaining supply nearly impossible. Each pass consumed altitude. Each recovery required power settings that stressed the engine. Each firing burst brought the aircraft closer to the mechanical limits that governed its continued operation. The chaos of the engagement fragmented any coherent picture of results. Enemy aircraft scattered in multiple directions, some trailing smoke, others diving for the cloud cover below. The coordinated formation that had threatened the incoming bombers was dissolving, individual pilots pursuing individual survival rather than maintaining tactical coherence. This was the achievement that doctrine could not quantify. Not aircraft destroyed, though damage had certainly been inflicted, not enemy pilots killed, though casualties had almost certainly occurred. The achievement was disruption. The breaking of coordinated defensive response, the conversion of organized resistance into scattered confusion that the arriving bombers could transit without facing concentrated opposition. The observable evidence of what Kearby's decision had accomplished became visible in the minutes following his engagement. The enemy fighters that had been climbing toward interception altitude were no longer climbing in formation. They were scattered across a vertical mile of airspace, some pursuing the troublesome American fighter, others descending to regroup, still others breaking off entirely to return to their airfields. The bombers that crossed through this airspace encountered opposition that was fragmentary rather than coordinated. Individual fighters approached from angles that suggested opportunism rather than tactical planning. Their attacks pressed without the mutual support that made defensive interceptions effective. The heavy aircraft sustained damage, but the concentrated assaults that could destroy formations did not materialize. For Kearby, the immediate aftermath of his extended engagement was a cockpit filled with competing demands for attention. The fuel gauge showed reserves that had dropped below comfortable margins, suggesting that extended maneuvering or navigation errors would create genuine crisis. The hydraulic pressure gauge had stabilized at a low reading, confirming that the system had lost enough fluid to render power-assisted functions unreliable. The wound in his shoulder had begun to throb with a deep, insistent pain that suggested tissue damage beyond simple surface injury. His wingmen, those who had maintained contact through the engagement, were somewhere in the surrounding airspace, their exact positions uncertain. Radio communication remained intermittent, brief transmissions breaking through static before dissolving into silence. The formation discipline that characterized his normal operations had evaporated in the chaos of extended combat, replaced by the individual decision-making that aerial combat ultimately demanded. The flight home required navigation through terrain that offered few emergency options. The Owen Stanley Range rose to altitudes that exceeded his aircraft's ceiling in its current damaged condition. The jungle below provided no clearings suitable for forced landing. The weather that had complicated the mission outbound remained uncertain, cloud layers concealing terrain features that he needed for visual navigation. Each mile toward home consumed fuel that could not be replaced, oil that was probably leaking from damaged lines, hydraulic fluid that might or might not provide enough pressure to deploy the landing gear when the moment came. The calculations that had governed his flying for months were breaking down, variables exceeding parameters, margins evaporating as the distance to safety slowly decreased. The approach to the airfield at Moresby required decisions that the damage had made unusually consequential. The hydraulic system might deploy the landing gear. It might not. Testing the system early would confirm function, but would leave the gear extended for the remainder of the flight, increasing drag, consuming additional fuel, eliminating options if the situation changed. Testing the system late would preserve fuel, but would leave less time to respond if the gear failed to deploy. Kearby chose late testing, preserving options until the last reasonable moment, trusting the calculation that had served him throughout his operational career. The gear handle moved. The hydraulic system responded slowly, grudgingly, pressure barely sufficient to drive the actuators through their range of motion. The main gear locked into position. The nose wheel extended and locked. 3 green lights confirmed what the mechanical sounds had already suggested. The landing was unremarkable by combat aviation standards. The aircraft touched down at normal speed, rolled to a stop on its functional gear, taxied to dispersal without requiring emergency assistance. Ground crew members approaching the aircraft noted the damage, the holes in the wing and fuselage, the dark, staining that suggested hydraulic fluid loss. They noted the pilot emerging from the cockpit with visible blood on his flight suit, moving carefully, favoring his left shoulder, but moving under his own power. The mission debrief that followed attempted to reconstruct what had happened over Wewak. The accounts were fragmentary, perspectives limited by the chaos of extended aerial engagement. Kearby reported multiple enemy aircraft engaged, probable damage to several, definite disruption of the coordinated formation that had threatened the bomber stream. His wingmen confirmed portions of his account, added details from their own perspectives, contributed to a composite picture that remained necessarily incomplete. What could be confirmed was that the bomber formation had transited the engagement area with losses significantly below what the initial enemy response had threatened. What could be confirmed was that enemy coordination had broken down during the engagement period. Individual aircraft acting without apparent direction or mutual support. What could be confirmed was that Colonel Neel Kearby had sustained wounds and aircraft damage during extended combat that had substantially exceeded the normal parameters of fighter operations. The official recognition that followed the October 11th engagement took the form that military bureaucracy had long established for acts exceeding normal expectations. The Medal of Honor citation that eventually accompanied the award described the action in language stripped of the chaos, confusion, and physical cost that had characterized the actual event. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism. It noted the engagement of multiple enemy aircraft. It mentioned wounds sustained during the action. It recorded destruction of aircraft in terms that the evidence supported without definitive confirmation. The language was formal, measured, appropriate to an institution that had awarded the same recognition to recipients dating back decades across conflicts that had tested American military personnel in circumstances beyond civilian comprehension. What the citation could not capture was the specific quality of judgment that Kearby had demonstrated, not the courage to continue fighting, while wounded, though that courage was real and remarkable. Not the skill to execute complex maneuvers while damaged, though that skill was genuine and essential. What the citation missed was the calculation behind the continuation, the assessment that his individual risk was justified by the collective benefit, the decision that his probable survival was worth gambling against the certain destruction of coordinated bomber defense. This was not the heroism of impulse, the dramatic response of a pilot overwhelmed by circumstances and responding with instinctive aggression. This was the heroism of analysis, of a pilot who understood exactly what he was risking and chose to risk it anyway because the mathematics supported the choice. Kearby knew the fuel margins, knew the damage limitations, knew his own physical condition well enough to estimate his continued combat effectiveness. He made the decision to continue with full awareness of its probable cost. The months following October 11th saw Kearby's reputation grow within the 5th Air Force. His victory total increased, his methods studied by younger pilots who sought to understand how systematic aggression differed from reckless enthusiasm. He continued flying missions with the same calculated approach that had characterized his career before the Medal of Honor engagement, the same patient positioning, the same careful management of resources and risks. The end came in March 1944, over the same New Guinea terrain where he had demonstrated that discipline and courage could coexist. The circumstances were different, the engagement smaller, the outcome dependent on variables that even perfect calculation could not control. Enemy fire struck his aircraft in a manner that this time exceeded the P-47's considerable capacity for damage absorption. Colonel Neel Kearby went down into the jungle and did not return. The aerial combat that consumed his final months was never reducible to the terms that recognition and promotion employed. Words like heroism and valor captured something real, but missed something essential. The pilots who flew over New Guinea in 1943 and 1944 operated in an environment where survival required constant negotiation between acceptable risk and necessary aggression, where every engagement demanded decisions that training could inform but never fully specify. Kearby's contribution was demonstrating that this negotiation could be conducted analytically, that courage did not require abandoning judgment, that the methodical approach to aerial combat could produce results as remarkable as natural talent. His willingness to continue on October 11th, to remain in an engagement that doctrine said he should have left, was not a rejection of his analytical methods. It was their ultimate expression, a calculation that his training and experience allowed him to make with confidence that would have been impossible for a less systematic pilot. The P-47 Thunderbolt that carried him through that engagement was eventually repaired, Its damage documented for intelligence purposes, its systems restored to operational condition. It flew again, probably with different pilots, its participation in the October 11th engagement unmarked by any permanent record in its airframe. The aircraft's indifference to its own history was perhaps the most honest memorial to what had happened over Wewak. The machine performed as designed. The pilot performed beyond design. The difference between those performances was what the Medal of Honor attempted, imperfectly, to honor. The radio communications that enemy pilots exchanged during the engagement were never recovered in complete form. Intelligence fragments suggested confusion about the American fighter's intentions, surprise at its continued presence after sustaining damage, uncertainty about how to respond to tactics that violated expected patterns. What the fragmentary intercepts suggested, without proving, was that Kearby's decision to continue had created uncertainty in enemy pilots who relied on predictable American responses. The unpredictability itself became a weapon, as valuable as the rounds his guns had fired. In the end, the story of October 11, 1943, was not about a pilot who refused to slow down. It was about a pilot who calculated that acceleration served a purpose larger than his individual survival. That purpose was achieved. American bombers reached their targets. Enemy coordination failed. A formation that should have extracted a heavy toll was scattered before it could form. The cost was eventual. The value was immediate. The mathematics that Neel Kearby had spent years perfecting justified a decision that looked, to observers without his analytical framework, like simple aggression. It was not simple. It was the most complex calculation he ever made, weighing his life against the lives of bomber crews, his aircraft against the mission's success, his future against the immediate present. The conclusion he reached was correct by the only measure that mattered. The bombers came home. The calculation held. And somewhere in the archives of a war that consumed millions, a citation records in inadequate language what a wounded pilot in a damaged aircraft accomplished over New Guinea on an autumn morning when doctrine said he should have turned for home.